Hey there, you're listening to Delve, the official thought leadership podcast of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. My name is Eric Dicaire. I'm a journalist and podcast producer here at McGill, and today I'm going to talk to Rob Glew.
The sheer existence of prosocial behaviour and its important role in our functioning society shows that, well, not every decision is made on the basis of individual costs and benefits that we can kind of measure and interact with.
So Rob is an assistant professor of operations management, and in that clip, he's talking about people's desire to do the right thing, even if there's no immediate benefit to them. And as you're going to hear, humans have a natural tendency to step up and support their neighbors, but sometimes it's helpful to get a little nudge from the outside world. So we're going to kick off this interview with how some deeds are helpful to businesses and society, while others are not. Then we're going to get into what managers can do to encourage more causative behavior in their establishments. And spoiler alert, small things can make a big difference. So if you have thoughts about this episode, let's have a conversation. We post all of our content to LinkedIn, so you can let us know what you think in the comments. McGillDelve, that's McGill Delve. Come say hello. So all right, let's delve into today's interview. Professor Rob Glew, thanks so much for joining. How are you?
No problem. I'm very well. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So I'm really excited to have you here because we're talking about something very fascinating. So you've done a bit of research on this. We're kind of talking about nothing less than the greater good, which I find really fascinating, and just kind of how we can encourage people to behave in a way that sort of supports others and supports their community. And I mean, you have a term that we use to refer to this phenomenon. It's called pro-social behavior. And I don't know, to me this sounds a bit jargony, but it's not as complicated as it seems. But maybe we could just start with a little bit of an explanation of just what is pro-social behavior and what is pro-social behavior and what kind of situations might pro-social behavior be necessary?
So I think we'll do exactly that. Let's talk about what pro-social behavior is. And I think at the same time, let's also talk about why someone in a business school would care about, as you've described, Eric, kind of volunteering, people supporting the community, because that's not always the role that we might imagine business to want to have. So it's a jargony term, pro-social behavior, but we're using it really to refer to some kind of behavior that is individually costly, but then has this benefit for a wider community. So you can think of very kind of typical examples, like maybe the most obvious is some kind of volunteering. Like you volunteer to make sandwiches, you distribute those sandwiches to a food bank. That is pro-social behavior. But at the same time, it's also maybe slightly more tangible, maybe slightly less tangible examples, which are things like altruism in the workplace or mentorship, right? If I am supported by one of my more senior colleagues, that is a form of pro-social behavior. It is individually costly to them. They could do other things with that time, and yet they choose to spend that time helping me the same way that I might for my students, and we all do for our friends and family. And we call it pro-social, right? Pro meaning kind of in support of benefiting, and social meaning society. So when I say pro-social behavior, you can kind of think of, this behavior that is benefiting the functioning of society as we know it, be it society in the micro level, right, the community around you, your friendships, or as we're going to talk more about later when we get to my research, society in the macro sense of the whole society of which we are all part of in Canada, in the UK, wherever.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I mean, rationally, it feels like, okay, like it's clear that I should behave in a certain way because it benefits everyone. And I can think of some situations where that might be necessary. Like just think about when you're driving, like not cutting people off on the freeway and that kind of thing. But we know that doesn't always happen. People get emotional. They can often be irrational. So like why do you think that we need to encourage pro-social behavior at all? Because it seems like something we should all want and that we should have a natural inclination to do.
Well, I think that as people listen to this conversation, I would encourage them to reflect on what you've just said, Eric. Is it rational? That is a very good question. Is it rational for me to give up my time to go and donate blood to support a blood drive? It is bit painful for me, a bit inconvenient. I could use that time doing something else. Arguably, at an individual level, actually, pro-social behaviour isn't economically rational. But we know that from behavioural research, especially behavioural economics, that people do engage in this behaviour. And that when people don't, when people are more what we might say antisocial, the opposite of pro-social, it tends to be because we are very self-interested, or we have this bias towards like the immediate value in what we're doing. And often pro-social behaviour, to take my example of donating blood or volunteering your time, or even your example of whether you cut someone off on the highway or not, is associated with kind of these longer term benefits, or these benefits that accrue to people who you don't see and interact with.
Yeah, that's super fascinating because like when you describe it that way, like it almost seems like a miracle that we've made it this far because like we've built these systems and these structures, like our society is built on collective action. Like what's an organization if not just a group of people working together towards a common goal? But I guess we're incentivizing it with like pay structures and that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess it all gets a little bit complicated.
But I think you're right, Eric. And if anything, pro-social behavior is the example that disproves the economic myth. My colleagues and I'm guilty of this too. We write economics papers, we write management papers. We say, assuming X is rational, assuming the decision maker is rational, they do this, they do that. And it leads to insights which we then go and tell to people. But the sheer existence of pro-social behavior and its important role in our functioning society shows that, well, not every decision is made on the basis of individual costs and benefits that we can kind of measure and interact with. And to come back to a point that I teased at the start, I think this is actually why it's very important that we study it in a business school. It's that the way we interact in society is through the structures created by businesses. And so often businesses have a say in kind of how we create these interactions, what interactions we encourage and what we incentivize. I did some work while I was there, and the pro-social action is for me to pick up my cup of coffee and put it in the box to kind of self-bus my table. And that business requires that. They don't have enough staff. They don't to clear this whole space every time to wipe down all these tables.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's it. Like you can start at a very small example like bussing tables, and then I mean, now I guess we're kind of getting into your research. So like you can expand that to like these really big things. So like COVID-19 was a huge example of this. Like, and we're talking about life or death situation here where pro-social behavior can literally prevent the spread of disease. So, I mean, you looked at a particular case and it was in the UK, right?
Yeah. So to touch on briefly on the context of this study, right?
Sure.
We were looking at a university in the UK that instigated a voluntary disease testing program during COVID-19. So it covered all 15,000 of their students, and they had the option of being tested once a week in their kind of household group. So it was an interesting design. It was meant to be very efficient. You would receive a single test tube to your household and up to 20 swabs. You'd all individually swab, put them all together in the test tube. And then it's efficient because if you confirm that everyone is negative, you have achieved 20 tests in one. And the cost and the time is in running the tests. So economically speaking, you really want to encourage people to participate in this household scheme because it reduces the time to get test results. It reduces the cost of testing people. And the small change that I examined in my research was that for the first 10 or so weeks of this program, households received individually named test kits. So if you and I lived together, a couple other people, it would say on this envelope that came to us, Rob and Eric and Sanjeet and Rim all live together. And they are, you take this test, you put the envelope back in the internal post, it gets collected and tested, you get the result the next day. The trouble was, and again, putting my operations management professor efficiency hat on, that the trouble is that this is very inefficient. And it's very complex and it's very difficult. We are recording this at the time of a postal strike in Canada. We know that relying on getting mail from A to B, even inside the same city, can be very difficult. So the operations managers behind the program decided, well, let's not worry about names. Let's just make all the test kits the same. Test kit 1, 2, 3, ABC, it goes to a household, it doesn't matter which one, they're all identical. You scan a barcode and you take the test. It's exactly the same process as far as the students are concerned. They're still swabbing themselves once a week. What could possibly change? And it's going to reduce the cost, make it much more efficient. So in my research, we show that essentially overnight when that change happened, the testing rate, essentially the pro-social behaviour, because these people were volunteering, dropped by 22%. And then the research is, based on that setting, is really an exploration of why. So zoom out beyond disease testing, beyond the context of the pandemic, and just think, essentially what happened here was we were referring to someone by their name, and then we stopped. And when we stopped, they became 22% less likely to exhibit this beneficial pro-social behavior.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like that's I just want to hold on that for a second, because that's really interesting, because that's like an operational change that was a decision that someone made. And just to like put a point on the impact that a manager can have in this kind of scenario, something as simple as putting your name on a box or on a piece of mail. Can you tell me a little bit more about why? Because like that's fascinating to me. That stands out to me as like a pretty radical change for such a small decision.
So the best kind of simple explanation for what's going on, and the details are more complex, and there's lots of small factors in this, but the best explanation of what's going on in this phenomenon with the 20% drop in pro-social behavior just by removing names is that name prompts this sense of accountability in people. Oh, someone knows who I am. Someone cares about what I'm doing. And that in turn prompts this self-image concern that, someone cares what I'm doing, so someone knows if I'm being bad or not. And in the same way, when we take off the name, it appears that cognitive link disappears, that the link to self-image is much weaker, and that seems to be what's driving this significant drop in people's willingness to volunteer, to be pro-social, just when their name is removed.
Yeah. So accountability. I mean, I guess it's perceived accountability, because like realistically, would someone get in trouble in that scenario if they didn't actually perform the COVID test?
No, not at all. There was nothing hanging over people. Right? It was. So it's entirely, as you say, perceived accountability. Nothing changed.
All right. So we're about halfway through the episode. So here's a quick recap of what we've covered so far. So pro-social behavior is when a person acts in the best interest of a larger group, even when it's inconvenient. And businesses and government programs can encourage this kind of behavior through small but impactful choices, like putting a name on a box so the recipient feels more inclined to take a COVID-19 test. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, hey, that sounds kind of manipulative, you're not alone. So we're going to get into that next. Yeah, so that's really interesting, because this is a contextual factor. This is like no one's saying, hey, stop swearing, or hey, do this COVID test, you specifically, like explicitly, right? That's interesting to me, because when you take a macro look at that and you just think about some visceral reactions that some people have to like the COVID lockdowns, for example, or to driving your car less to reduce the impact on climate change, like people tend to get defensive. And so these little contextual changes, it's almost like manipulation almost. And so I'm just curious what your thoughts are there, like, because some people might feel uncomfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. So I think I agree. And that's something that has concerned me all the way through this work is, well, is there an element of this that is Big Brother is watching you? Big Brother knows your name. Big Brother knows whether Eric took his test or not. So I think let me compare this to the very early research on accountability and pro-social behavior that looked at a coffee pot in a research lab. This was one of the first papers published on this topic. And over time, they tried a few different things. First, they put sticky eyes above the coffee pot. And the problem was that people were not refilling the coffee when they finished it. And so, people would come later and they'd have to wait 10 minutes for the coffee to brew. As an academic institution, all of us, function on copious amounts of coffee. It would be a complete disaster. Productivity would be destroyed. So they put these eyes there, just watching eyes. And they measured then what was the frequency of people of finishing the coffee and not refilling it. And they found that the googly eyes had a big effect.
Wow.
And then they tried putting a plastic camera pointing at it, which is obviously much more kind of big brother than the googly eyes. The googly eyes, they're not anyone's actual eyes. There's no one is actually watching.
It's less threatening.
But the camera, someone is watching. And so the benefit from nothing to eyes was substantial. The benefit from eyes to camera, very minor. Still a benefit, right? If you want to force people to follow the rules, you can create a police state. But it was more viewed as the researchers of the social expectation is almost as powerful as the threatening kind of big brother alternative.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, okay, because I am curious about applications. So, I don't know. Maybe we could look at this at two different levels, because I think we could look at it like a broad level, like speeding on roads, for example, and maybe we could start a little bit more micro. So, I'm curious if you can give me an example of, like, if I'm the owner of a restaurant or a store or some kind of small business, and I would like to promote certain kind of pro-social behavior in my establishment. Like how should I be thinking about this? How can I apply these learnings to make the whole experience at my institution a little bit better for everyone, including myself?
So let me use a few examples which are going to seem very small, but if there's one takeaway from all of this work, it's that very small things can have a very large impact when it comes to pro-social behavior. One example is the self-service checkout at the grocery store, right? We've all used this. You go, you scan your own items, etc. This research suggests that the simple step of getting you to scan your loyalty card at the start of the process, so to walk up to the checkout, scan your loyalty card, and then throw up on the screen, Eric's grocery shop. That simple step should be enough to reduce the level of essentially theft that happens at self-checkouts, right? There's countless stories. In fact, I think one grocery store in the UK actually paused its rollout of these self-service checkouts because of the level of theft that was happening. And so it's a big problem, and these small changes can have outsized effects.
And so, like, that's accountability as a tool, right? So I'm curious about other kinds of tools. Like, I could think of one, for example, like like in cities, like they say that if you want to get people to drive more slowly, like make the roads narrower, plant more trees, makes visibility a little less, it makes things a little less visible so people drive more safely. I'm curious, like, what other tools, like, people might be able to apply in this case.
I like your example a lot, Eric, because it shows that it's an environmental thing. The same way that what we've talked about with names is about small changes to the environment in which we behave, so is yours. I think that there's two things that I would draw on that are well presented in existing research on this. One of them is this idea of a mission framing. We saw this with the American Red Cross donation campaign that I mentioned earlier, but it's this mission framing of you are performing, you are doing this, you and us against the problem, against the enemy. That is a very strong motivator of people's pro-social behavior. Another one is reputation. That there's a fascinating study of blood donations in Italy. So in some Italian provinces, when you donate blood, they actually have a public leaderboard of who has donated the most blood. And even more than that, when you hit milestones, 50, 100, 150 donations in your lifetime, you get rewards at public ceremonies in front of people. So this is not accountability the same way we're talking about it here. It's reputation. It's a different form of identity.
It's like gamification.
Yeah, essentially it is a form of gamification. And so what we see is there's some interesting work that shows that people are very concerned with their public pro-social reputation. And if you can leverage that, you can also get people to be more pro-social. Now, is that a little bit big brothery? I don't like that as much as the accountability work, because I think it can lean a little bit like, oh, are we going to have a leaderboard at the grocery store of who's stolen the fewest items this month at this grocery store?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think the one thing that we know for sure is that economic incentives are terrible. economic incentives for pro-social behavior backfire. You cannot pay people to stop speeding. You cannot pay them to give blood, like as in pay for hour. It just doesn't work. As soon as you start paying me, my social concerns go out the window. They become purely economic concerns. But if you withhold the payment and try to leverage just my social concerns, then you can, hopefully more successful in motivating me.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of hopeful, to be honest, that we can appeal to people's good nature to encourage certain behaviors. Really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that the research tells us that we should have some faith in humanity. That, like you said at the start, is it economically rational to be nice to our fellow humans, to mentor people? Not necessarily, but people do it anyway. And as long as I think we appreciate that that's a very fickle behavior and that it's very subject to contextual environmental factors, that we can't pay people to do it, but we can create an environment that nudges and encourages that behavior, that holds people accountable, leans on their reputation, and acknowledges that we have this kind of self-image concern that is much more powerful than any economic concern. I think if we can combine all of that, you can achieve very, very positive social outcomes in all different settings, be they business or beyond.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a very positive note to end on. So, Professor Rob Glew, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
All right, and that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. So there's a ton to take away from this conversation. So I'm going to leave you with the final plug. Come check us out on LinkedIn and look for the post about this episode and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the episode, what you learned from it, if it changed the way you think about management, or maybe it didn't. So our page is called McGill Delve. So that's McGillDelve, McGill Delve. We'd love to hear from you. So a special thanks to Professor Rob Glew for joining us today. So this episode is actually inspired by one of his research papers on pro-social behavior during COVID-19. So I'm going to leave a link to it in the show notes in case you'd like to check it out. McGill Delve is the official thought leadership platform of the Dicaire Faculty of Management here at McGill University. My name is Eric Dicaire. I was your host today. I also edited and produced the show. Saku Mantara is our editor-in-chief, and he made all the original music. So all right, that's a wrap, and we'll catch you next time.